is this serving me? And I know we did one where I sort of did the will it make my boat go faster? We're sort of in a similar theme, but what I want to get you into, and I know we've covered it previously, but just sort of remind you, question everything. Just because you've done things a certain way doesn't mean it's the right way of doing it. Welcome to Life of a CISO. I'm Dr. Eric Cole, your host, and we'll be taking you on a journey each week on what it takes to be a CISO and what are solutions that you can implement today if you are currently a Chief Information Security Officer or if you want to be one in the future. This is Life of a CISO. Welcome, my fans. You know what time it is. It's time for Life of a CISO with yours truly. Dr. E is in the house. Here we go. Hope you are ready to rock and roll. One of the things I want to talk about today are sort of some of the trends I'm noticing in cybersecurity, which is essentially just because we've been doing it a certain way for a certain period of time doesn't mean it's right. One of the things I'll often get when I go into companies, and I was overseas doing this big security assessment, and I'm working with the security team, and what they kept pushing back on me is, but Eric, this is how we've always done it. And I finally look at them and say, so is that justification for continuing to do it that way? And they sort of looked at me and I'm like, let me ask you a question. How did you start doing it? Like, you're telling me this is how you've always done it. So how did you decide that these were the right things to do? And it got real interesting because they said, well, 5 years ago when I started at the company, a senior engineer who's no longer here, he's retired, he basically told me this is the way we do it. So I just kept following, doing what he did. I'm like, interesting. So if we decide to do it a different way, there's no pride of authorship here. And he sort of paused because at first he was like, no, he's like defending it, but he's like, yeah, I guess you're right. I didn't create this. And I'm like, not being critical here, just open conversation. I just like asking interesting questions. Did you ever verify or validate that this was the best method to implement security 5 years ago? It's like, well, no, this was a brilliant security engineer and we didn't have time and we were short-staffed, so we just followed it. And I'm like, and have you ever questioned whether this is still the best way of doing things? And he sort of paused, and I was like, that critical moment, I'm like, either he's gonna fight me or he's gonna give it. It was like, okay, I see where you're going. I'm like, okay, good. We're heading in the right direction now, right? Because if somebody's gonna fight me the whole way, it's really hard to make change. So I keep trying to just come at it from different angles. But what I want to teach you before we get into the topic of security posture today is something that I started using in just my life in general, and I found it's extremely powerful in business. It's extremely powerful as I'm an entrepreneur, a CEO. You know, I have multiple companies, bought and sold, and do a lot in that space. It's been something that's been extremely valuable to me in that space, and I'm starting to use it with Chief Information Security Officers, and it's also really valuable. And the question is this serving me? And I know we did one where I sort of did the will it make my boat go faster? We're sort of in a similar theme, but what I want to get you into, and I know we've covered it previously, but just sort of remind you, question everything. Just because you've done things a certain way doesn't mean it's the right way of doing it. Now, if we were in a discipline like accounting, financial, or even legal, those laws and regulations haven't really changed. So the way you've done things, I mean, maybe some adjustments, some tweaks in tax laws, but I mean, the tax laws are pretty much the same. The legal, the law, right, the Constitution, right? We haven't rewrote that thing in a long time, right? So pretty steady state there. So those fields may be a little better, but in cybersecurity, remember, this is the ultimate game of leapfrog. Anytime we develop a defense, the attackers develop an offense, and then we counter it. So it's one of those where if you've been doing the same thing for a long time, in cybersecurity, that's fairly dangerous. Now, strategy, no. Tactics, yes. If you have a strategy like managing risk and asking the question, what is the value and benefit? What is the risk and exposure? And only do it if the benefit's worth the risk, right? That's fundamental, right? Those things don't change. But the actual tactical day-to-day of how you're managing and running your organization does change on a regular basis. So the first thing I want to really ask as we get into this topic of security posture is honest. No pride of authorship, no ego, nothing else. Just really completely honest. Is what you're doing at your company for cybersecurity really working? Now remember, no defense, I'm on your side, I'm here, but I just gave you some truth serum. And we're chatting, no one else is around, just you and me, two buddies, having fun, and I just ask you that question. Is what you're doing really working? Do you really feel you're being proactive? Do you really feel the executives understand and know security? Do you really feel that if a breach happened tomorrow, they would not be surprised and you would be able to handle it in a timely manner? Or do you think that if a breach happened tomorrow, you'd possibly lose your job? Right, so these are things we want to think about. And why I want to talk about today's topic is every few months, I like sort of doing what I call sort of like a back to the basics, where we just sort of refresh and remind everyone what we're doing in cybersecurity. And it's funny, I gave a keynote, similar topics to this, and just a few days ago. And it's funny because one person came up to me afterwards and he's like, Eric, dynamic, you're always engaging. I always love listening to you. You always have new stories. He goes, but today I was a little surprised because normally you have sort of new tips and tricks. But today you just sort of did the standard stuff. You did the standard basic stuff that I knew and I think everybody knew. So I don't think your presentation really was that effective. And I always love that type of feedback. It's like, is it a compliment? Is it an insult? A little of both. Let's fist pump and have a good day. But the point is, I then asked him, I said, can I appreciate that advice, and I'm glad you felt comfortable telling me, can I ask you a few questions? I said, so is everything I talked about you're currently doing? So everything we talked about today with the risk posture, I said, so if I go to your organization, you have a clear risk posture, authority, responsibility, you have a risk escalation. I said, so all that stuff is taken care of. He's like, no. And I'm like, so is it your advice a little, or your feedback to me a little ironic? He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you tell me you know what you're doing, but you're not doing it. So clearly you need to keep being told in different manners, right? It's sort of like you tell me I need to go to the gym, but you're not going to the gym. So if I was a good friend of yours, what should I tell you? You need to go to the gym. Now you could be like, Eric, I know that. Yes, but you're not doing it. So therefore I need to remind you, I need to figure out why you're not doing it so I could better incentivize and help you doing it. I said, so that was sort of the intent of the talk was, yes, I know you've heard it, but most people aren't following it. So to me, you got to keep reiterating the basics. And I remember example is a friend of mine was coaching a basketball team, and it was a young, I think they were like 8 or 10-year-olds, and he had to go out for a few weeks. So he asked if I could sort of sub in and like take over the practices and the games for a little bit. So I said, sure. I said, so how's the team doing? He says, great, talented kids, really good kids. I'm like, what's your record? He said, 0-4. I said, interesting. I said, is that what we want? Or like, if I win a few games, are you going to be mad? Because I was like, I mean, he lost every game. So I'm like, do you want me to continue losing? Because I could do that, but I just want to make sure if you come back and we won a few, you're not going to be mad at me. He's like, no. I definitely want to turn around. So I go to practice, and these kids, 8 to 10, are all sitting there, and they're trying three-pointers. They're trying behind the back. They're trying like Michael Jordan, through the leg. And I'm like, you guys, do you understand the concept of this game? And I think a few of them got a little mad. They're like, of course we do. I'm like, what's the concept of this game? And they're like, to get the ball in the basket. Cool. And then what's the bigger objective when you're in a game? To score more points than the other team. Great. So can we say that when we're on offense, the objective is to get the ball in the hoop? Yes. Now, question. If I do a layup or I do a this or I do a that, besides three-pointers, right? But other shots, do you get different amount of points? Like, no, you always get two. I'm like, so if I do an easy shot or if I do a hard shot, I get the same amount of points. And they said, yes. I said, so why don't we do easier shots? And it was like, I was speaking a foreign language. Like, but Eric, this stuff is cool. I'm like, but none of your baskets are going in. You realize you're scoring no points. You might think you look good, but you don't look good. That's not going in. So all I did was the first night of practice I took over, all we did was layups. All we did was layups, nothing but layups. And it's funny because I got a few notes from parents who are like, I know you're filling in for the coach, but just so you know, the kids really didn't like practice tonight. They said it was boring. They said it wasn't fun. They saw all that other stuff. And I wrote back, I'm like, are you sending them to me or this league for excitement and entertainment or to learn how to play basketball? I said, because I thought, and maybe I'm wrong, I thought it was to learn to play basketball. And guess what? When you're learning to play something, it's not always fun. Sometimes it's redundant. Sometimes it's boring, right? It's not always fun. Do you think reviewing logs is fun? No, but it's a necessity that I have to do sometimes. So I was sort of getting like this weird reaction from the parents. Then something interesting happened. We have our first game, and we win. Now, it's not criticism. Now it's like, oh, what are you doing? And basically, to sort of wrap this up, because I'm not here to talk about basketball, but the point was, if you don't have the basic fundamental foundations in place, then doing advanced doesn't help. Second, if you're not achieving the outcome, you get no points for making it harder. If you do a double behind the back alley loop with the ball through the legs and do a half twist behind the back swish, you get 2 points. If you do a simple basic layup, you get 2 points. So why don't we learn the basics and get the points in a simple, easiest manner as possible? Why are we making it harder for ourselves? Why are we doing things that are a lot more difficult? And then to make a long story short, the coach came back and they were 3-4. We won all 3 games because we just went back to the basics. So I urge you sometimes is really be honest with yourself. Is what you're doing working? And then really go in and say, are there easier or simpler ways to implement security? And that's where I sort of introduce security posture. What I like about security posture over cybersecurity is security is not something you achieve. It's something you manage. So posturing means I'm constantly managing it. I'm constantly adjusting it. I'm constantly tracking it. Because that's really the trick. We all know, and like I said, I'm going to do a couple of refreshers here, but it's good to remind us. And I'm going to give you sort of some tips and tricks as a CISO. First one to remember, 100% security doesn't exist. Now, if you've heard me talk, I sometimes play around and have a little fun and get a little cute with this one. Right? In any practical sense, 100% security doesn't exist. Now, I remember one time I was giving a talk, and the slide comes up behind me, and I go, is that really true? I say 100% security doesn't exist, but is that really completely true? I said, what if I take a cell phone and I smash it into pieces, I put it in the ground, and I bury it? Can we all agree that we have 100% security? And I remember this one particular because I always love interacting with people. It just makes life so much more fun. And somebody in the front row goes, well, no. And I'm like, no? He's like, you could glue it back together. And I'm like, really? You can't work with me here. We're really going to go there. I'm like, okay, sir. So what do we need to do? He's like, you need to burn it. You need to pour gasoline on it and light it on fire. And I'm like, okay. He got a little too excited there. I'm like, okay, this is getting a little weird, but we'll go with it. We'll roll. I'm good. So, okay. Take a cell phone. Smash it to pieces. Burn it to a crisp. Nothing's left. Buried in the ground. Put cement on it. Are we good? Can we sort of work with me here and agree we can have 100% security? Yes. But what's the issue, my friends? What is now the value? What is now the functionality of that device now that we've achieved this miraculous state of 100% security? Zero. Zero is no value. So, which means if we want to have any value, if we want to have any functionality, we won't be able to achieve 100% security. So you sort of have on this spectrum, you have 100% security at the top with zero functionality. We can't go there. We just talked about that. Well, the other extreme is, what if we just leave everything open? 100% functionality. Anybody can do anything, any place they want. Give everybody administrator, give everyone open ports, give everyone access. Clearly, that's not going to work either because there's no security in place. So now the question is, where do we find the sweet spot? Where do we find that sweet spot? And in doing and finding the sweet spot, remember the law of cybersecurity. Law of cybersecurity is just like the law of gravity, always at play, always working. Law of cybersecurity is simple. When you add functionality, you decrease security. When you add functionality, you increase risk. So now the question is, how much functionality is too much? And that's where we get to our simple question. What is the value and benefit? What is the risk and exposure? And then you ask a simple question, is the benefit worth the risk? Because that's really all we're doing here. I mean, people always come up to me when they find out what I do for a living. They're always like, oh, you're going to tell me I can't do this. You're going to tell me how vulnerable I am. You're going to make me change my passwords. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do any of that. What I'm going to tell you is real simple. I'm going to make sure you understand the risk that's associated with your decision. And then it's up to you. If you go in and say the value and benefit is worth the risk, do it. If the value and benefit is not worth the risk, don't do it. But that's all we're talking about with security posture. We're just managing and tracking the new functionality we're adding, the value and benefit it provides, and the new risks and exposures it creates. And then we're just asking ourselves a simple question. Is that value worth the risk? Plain and simple. So now we're starting to get down to something that we can start to manage. Now, with all of that, I'm not going to get into all the risk equals threat vulnerability. We all know that stuff. But what I want to touch on there is this. If the way we're running a company is we're constantly adding functionality that's decreasing security, and the way we're doing this is by training people to ask questions. What is the value and benefit? What is the risk and exposure? Is the value worth the risk? What is really the most critical tenet that's required for this to work? You must have an agreed to, published security posture. What is your security posture? What is and what is not acceptable level of risk? We all have this in our lives, whether you realize it or not. There are some people that don't fly on airplanes. Too big a risk. To me, that's an acceptable risk for the value and benefit that I get. Some people like to rock climb. Some people, the risk is too great. So the way we're living our current lives, whether we realize it or not, is based on this law of what we do, we find that the value and benefit is worth the risk. And that's why sometimes we might stop doing things. For example, during COVID, many people stopped going out to restaurants. Many people stopped going to the gym. In some cases, the government closed down businesses. But wait a second. How come in two years earlier, it was okay, and now it's not? It's because now the risk and exposure was too great. Now when people said, well, the value and benefit of going out to eat is now not worth the risk exposure because there's a new risk, they stopped going out to eat. And then when whatever happened with COVID and sort of went away, disappeared, healed, whatever occurred there, right? And people started now going, okay, now they're willing to go back to a restaurant because now they feel that the risk is more manageable. But that's all we're doing here. But the question is, how can your VPs, directors, and managers properly manage and assess risk if they don't know what the posture is? If they don't know what your corporate position is on cybersecurity? If you don't tell them this is acceptable and this is not, how can they properly manage it? This, by far, my friends, is the biggest problem in security today. Is companies don't have a risk posture and they're following the old paradigm that's a broken paradigm. The old paradigm that's a broken paradigm is this. If we don't have a breach, security's doing their job. If we do have a breach, security's failed. And executives that are implementing anything related to P&L, they have all of the authority. And when it comes to cybersecurity, the CISO has all of the responsibility. So essentially what happens there is you have these situations where VPs and directors and managers will start doing things and either leave security out or security's in the loop and security tells them, this is not acceptable. And they basically say, tough. It's making money. It's doing better. We're going to do it anyway. So basically, and then even though security said this is too big a risk, too big an exposure, you couldn't do it, and they do it anyway, and then security is right. They're spot on. It was not an acceptable risk, and the organization gets compromised. What happens? VP gets promoted, CISO gets fired. Just because we've done things a certain way doesn't mean it's right and doesn't mean it's working. That is one of the most broken paradigms in security today. There's no risk posture. VPs, directors, and managers have all of the authority. CISO has all the responsibility, but no authority. Nobody has to listen to them. Nobody has to do anything. And as long as there's no breach, they keep their job. And as soon as there's a breach, they get fired. That's a broken model, my friends. That does not work. If that is how your organization is being run, you are not going to win. You are not going to be able to win. You are not setting yourself up for success. So when it comes to security posture, the first thing you must do, do not pass go, do not collect $200. You must do this, is you must get an agreement on a risk posture. You must push it out to all the execs, and then you notify the execs, listen, this isn't me versus you anymore. So if you're going to do something and it's not acceptable risk, I'm not going to argue and debate with you. It's real simple. Here's acceptable risk. You can do anything up to that acceptable level. So you're allowed to play and do whatever you want as long as you're there. When you exceed that acceptable level of risk, it's simple. If you decide to accept it, you are accepting the responsibility, and we will tell the executives that you've accepted this risk, and then the executives have final say on whether that is or is not okay. We're not going to fight with you. We're not going to debate. This is the new model. You want the responsibility, you want the authority, and you have it. We're now giving you the responsibility to go with it. And now every month you present to the executives all decisions made by execs that were unacceptable. Now, here's what will happen. In the beginning, they're not going to like it. Nobody likes change, especially nobody likes change that puts more accountability on them. Why would they? They liked it the old way. I like that. I mean, I don't, but they liked it the old way where they could do whatever they wanted and you got in trouble. That's sort of weird and cool and bizarre in some messed up universe, right? But basically, I can go in and do whatever I want and you get punished. Crazy, right? But it just institutes no responsibility. So now that we're putting responsibility, nobody's going to like it. So they're going to fight and say, this is stupid. But the reality is, the executives are going to be behind it because they know the current model's not working. This is sort of the only possible way for it to work. Then, once you get past that hurdle, they're not going to like being put on the list. So you might get some death threats, you might need a bodyguard, right? Because now all of a sudden it's like you're basically telling on them, but it's like, no, you're doing something that's not acceptable and we need to make the executives aware. Now, if you have a good supporting executive, what's going to happen is in the beginning, there's going to be a lot of these. Everyone's going to test the waters. There's going to be like 15 or 20 of these a month where these execs are just going to go hog wild. And what should happen is the CEO should look at most of these and be like, no, what are you thinking? You're really going to put us at risk where maybe we'll make another 10 mil, but we could lose 20 mil because of a cyber attack. Have you lost your mind? No. And most of these decisions are going to get vetoed out, negated. Then what's going to happen is they're going to start to realize that unless it's a very, very rare exception, the CEO is the one who picked the risk posture. They're not going to go against it. So what's going to happen is all of a sudden the violations are going to decrease dramatically. And then maybe you're going to deal with maybe 1 or 2 a quarter because most people know, listen, let's work with security and come up with an appropriate option for fixing this, because not doing it, we're just going to get in trouble, we're just going to get negated, and it's not going to work anyway. So then, now that we have a risk posture in place, then what is security posture? Security posture is really about controlling and managing access, movement across the network, and privilege escalation. So now what we want to try to do is say, how can we control and manage who's getting into our network? How can we control and manage who's getting in? How can we control and manage what they have access to, where they can go, and what they can access in terms of escalating? So if I have a normal user and I escalate up. And once again, this is where you have to recognize you're going to have to make paradigm shifts. You're going to have to make massive changes in how you run the business. An example, what is the most common way of gaining access to a system? Social engineering a user or an exec, known as phishing. So sending them an email that sort of looks legitimate with an attachment or an embedded link. Now, user awareness and other things, you could start to manage it. But now with AI, my friends, that's unacceptable. To me, allowing email from an unknown external source that contains an embedded link or an attachment is an unacceptable risk. Unacceptable. Today, there's no way. You should still do user awareness. Don't get me wrong. Very, very in favor of user awareness, but but that's not a guarantee. They could get around this. So now you have to look and say, is the value and benefit of allowing external people to send us embedded links and attachments worth the risk and exposure? And to me, it might have been a year ago, it might have been 2 years ago, but today it's absolutely no. So these are the things we need to start doing. So I want you to spend some time, if you're a CISO or wanting to become a CISO, of just reevaluating your security posture, looking at what you're doing and asking, is this still working?